Hey guys, and thank you for coming back for the second video in my perfect punctuation series. And today we're going to be talking about the comma. So, as I stated in my first video, I am aiming to teach you the rules and basics of punctuation that you will need when writing fiction, short stories, dialogues and books. It's not a masterclass in all types of punctuation, and it's not claiming to be research for an English degree. This is just an easy to follow guide for basic punctuation with hopefully lots of examples that you can understand. I did a lot of research for this series. I spoke to a lot of other writers and I asked them what they would have found useful if someone had told them about it earlier, and I've tried to include it all to the best of my ability. Now, onwards with today's topic. As I said, we are talking about the comma. This is one of the most common punctuation symbols. It's used to indicate a pause in a sentence, to form a kind of list within a sentence, to separate information and to add additional information, or before a common conjunction word such as and, but, yet, or, so, etc. Commas can get a little confusing, you know. We can admit this, can't we? It's just us here, we can admit that. Especially when you have to remember all of the rules. So we're going to start with the basics, using the comma to indicate a pause, which is how most people use a comma and would tell you how to use it. If you asked anybody, like, how do you use a comma? Why do you use a comma for? They'd be like, well, when you pause in a sentence and where you pause, that's how you indicate your pause. That's your pause indication. Okay, so that's what we're going to go with first. Here is an example of the comma being used to create a pause point in the sentence. The cat didn't like chicken. He preferred fish. Sounds a bit like mine, or buggers as well. If you're unsure of where to put your commas, you can always read your sentence aloud, and this should show you where you would naturally pause. Believe it or not, there are more than one type of comma, and they all have different jobs. So I'm going to go through them all separately, and hopefully this will make things a lot easier to understand. Okay? Rather than only telling you when to use a comma, I'm going to try and explain the jobs that they have, as I find this makes it easier to remember when and how to use them. So first up, we have the listing comma. Just as the name implies, it is used when forming a descriptive list or to separate items within a sentence. The whole point of a comma, any comma, is to make your writing easier to understand, to make your meaning very clear, and to eliminate any confusion. You would use a listing comma between words, phrases, or clauses that appear in a series of 3 or more. Okay? That means that one word is a standalone. The cat was black. There was nothing to add here, so no comma was needed. 2 words are dealt with the use of the word and, as the second word is an additional piece of information. The cat was black and white. Once again, we did not need to use a comma. When we start moving on to 3 or more words, this is when our little comma friend makes his appearance. He is replacing the word and. We do this to make the sentence easier to understand, but also for a visual reason. Technically, you could keep using the word and, but this is, in my opinion, a very childish way of writing or speaking. If you think of an excited toddler, for example. The cat was black and white and ginger. It sounds like a young child getting very excited to tell you about something. And while it's cute on a kiddie, it's not how us adults speak or write, or at least it shouldn't be. Okay. What you would do would be use a comma. The cat was black, white and ginger. See how that just looks and sounds so much better. Okay, so let's look at the comma as a way of separating information, or as I like to call it, side note information. It's a little addition that you need that doesn't really fit into the original flow of the sentence. My car, which once belonged to my dad, is old but reliable. This sentence is a good example of using a comma before a common conjunction word, in this case the word but, where you would naturally pause. Old but reliable. There is an exception to this rule, as there are with most things. If the two main clauses are short and the sentence is very simple, then the comma might not be needed. So, Jasmine rode and Frank walked. In most cases, do not use a comma before a conjunction that links two simple words or phrases. For example, two names and two actions. Okay. Frank and Jasmine ate and drank all night. As before, if you're listing more than 3 words or names, that is the time for you to whip out your little comma. Frank, James and Jasmine stayed up all night eating and drinking. The purpose of the comma is to make the sentence very easy and obvious to understand, but it's also to help with the flow. So if I hadn't have used a comma in that sentence, it would have looked like this. Frank, James and Jasmine stayed up all night eating and drinking. Well, that makes it look like Frank's last name is James. Frank James, which obviously isn't right. Frank and James and Jasmine stayed up all night eating and drinking. Okay, so that does clear up the confusion as to Frank's name, but once again it looks childish and not how we would phrase it if we were speaking it. If you're unsure of how your sentence reads, then please, please, please read your work out loud to see how it flows. Just reading that sentence out loud felt awkward and not at all comfortable, so I would know that it needed to be changed. Another time when you would use a comma is before a name, but this is only when someone is being addressed. Hi Grandma, how are you? This sentence would still make sense without the comma, so some people would think that you didn't need it. Like that little comma guy is redundant, but he's not. Please don't leave him out, as he can be the difference between "Let's eat, Dad" and "Let's eat, Dad." And we're not promoting cannibalism here, we're really not, so let's try and get that right. Okay, so to clarify, we would use a listing comma in a list where you could use the words and or instead. Do not use them anywhere else. Use a listing comma before the words and or only if this is necessary to make your meaning clear. So now we are moving on to the joining comma. He is slightly different to the listing comma and a tiny bit trickier to master, but once you get the basics you'll find that with practice it will become second nature to know when and how to use him. A joining comma, as the name suggests, is used to join 2 complete sentences into a single sentence. When using it, it must be followed by a suitable connecting word. Okay, the connecting words which would be used in this way are and, or, but, while, and yet. Here are some examples of it being used. You must finish that project by Monday or you will be fired. Jason applied for the promotion and we expect Sam to do the same. Remember that you cannot join 2 sentences with a joining comma without one of those joining words. So for clarification, here are some examples of it being used incorrectly. The British are notoriously bad at learning foreign languages. The Dutch are famously good at it. Mel and Sue once hosted a baking show. Noel and Sandy took over. These sentences do not have the required joining words. Joining two sentences like this is one of the most common punctuation errors, and one that I've done many times myself in the early days of writing, but it's also one of the easiest to avoid if you pay just a little bit of attention to what you're writing. You must either follow the comma with one of the connecting words listed before, or you must replace it with a semicolon, which I will cover in another video very soon. It's important to remember that most other connecting words cannot be preceded by a joining comma. For example, however, therefore, hence, consequently, nevertheless, and thus. Who doesn't like a good thus now and then, you know? But you can't use it with a comma. With this rule, the following examples are incorrect. Two members of the group were too ill to go on, however the rest decided to continue. West Ham are 2 points behind the leaders, therefore they must win their last game. Once again, these sentences required a semicolon to join them, not a comma. So to recap, use a joining comma to join two complete sentences with the words and, or, but, yet, or while. Do not use a joining comma any other way. The gapping comma. So many people get freaked out by this little guy, but there's no need to. The gapping comma is very easy to use. We would use one to show that one or more words have been left out when the missing words are simply repeats of words already used in the same sentence. So here's an example of a sentence without a gapping comma. So, some students wanted to base their school mascot on the name of their team. Others wanted to base it on the name of the school. A gapping comma would be used in the second half of the sentence, just before the second statement. Some students wanted to base their school mascot on the name of their team. Others on the name of the school. That little gapping comma allowed us to cut out unnecessary repeating words. I've also used a semicolon there to abide by the rules I explained before about joining commas, as there wasn't a correct joining word there. Again, I will explain the semicolon in another video. Now, here's where we get a little more complicated. You ready for this? A gapping comma and a listing comma can both be used in the same sentence to better convey your meaning, making your writing easier and clearer to understand. But don't worry, it's not as daunting as it sounds, I promise you. Work with me, we'll break it down, and we will make this as painless a lesson as possible. Here's an example. I'm going to tell you the commas as I read the sentence out so that you can spot them. Italy is famous for her composers and musicians, listing comma. France, gapping comma, for her chefs and philosophers, listing comma. And Poland, gapping comma, for her mathematics and logistics. I followed the rules of the gapping comma being used to show that words are missing, and the listing comma to create a list within the sentence, because there were 3 countries mentioned, and I used the correct connecting word of and. The gapping commas weren't strictly necessary here, I just added them to show you how it could work. You could leave them out and the sentence would still be perfectly clear. Italy is famous for her composers and musicians, France for her chefs and philosophers, and Poland for her mathematics and logistics. Again, I followed the rules. There were 3 or more countries, and I used the correct connecting word. This is a question of judgment and personal taste. I always prefer to have a simpler and less crowded sentence if I can. So if the sentence is clear without the additional gapping commas, then I would leave them out. personally, it's good to remember that when reading, people tend to naturally pause when they see a comma. Obviously, that's what most of us are taught in school. Add a comma when you pause. But you can actually draw out and fragment a sentence in a way that you don't want. So always read your work out loud to yourself. Pause for the commas and see if it feels clunky and fragmented to you. If it does, then leave them out or rewrite it into a way that sounds better for you. Honestly, I rarely, if ever, use a gap in comma myself. I prefer to change the sentence to avoid the repetition that we're eliminating with the gap in comma, as I find it can sometimes feel a little old-fashioned for my tastes, but that is purely personal preference and how I prefer to write. You will develop your own skill and style in time. That's how writing works. Lastly, we have the lovely little bracketing commas, a cute little pair, sometimes called isolating commas, that have a completely different job to the other three, just to make life and writing so much more interesting. The little buggers. The rule with bracketing commas is that a pair of them are used to mark off a weak interruption in a sentence. This is to add additional information to a sentence and then continue the original sentence flow after, as if the brackets and interruptions never happened. Okay. They are basically used in place of brackets, especially in dialogue. Gemma, a friend of the family, came up the path and knocked on the door. The teaching assistant, who had come from another school, was named Rachel. Julie did, of course, like sausages. As you can see, I've used bracketing commas to add a little nugget of information. So here's the rule with bracketing commas. As I said before, the sentence before them should continue to flow as if the interruption never happened. That means if you took away the commas and the additional information, the remaining writing should fit together and make a seamless sentence that still makes sense. Okay? This is always the case with bracketing commas, and it gives you a very simple way of checking your punctuation. If you have offset some words with bracketing commas and you can't then remove those words without destroying the entire sentence, then you've written it wrong. Simple as that. For example, but beyond the door lay freedom. This looks like a lovely little sentence, but if you take away the commas and smush it together, it makes no sense. But lay freedom. That's not even a thing. That's not even a thing. The correct way to do this would have been to not get fancy and have it as a sentence in its own right. But beyond the door lay freedom. There's nothing wrong with keeping things simple. Here's another example of it being used incorrectly. She dug in her bag for her cigarettes and, finding them, quickly lit one. Again, as a sentence in a book, it sounds fine. It paints the scene quite nicely. But we're not here for that. We are here to make sure that the rules of punctuation aren't broken. And you, my friend, are a broken sentence. Take away the offset words, and what do you have? She dug in her bag for her cigarettes, quickly lit one. Does that sound right to you? You'd better not say yes, because if you do, you can get off this learning train right now. The sentence feels incomplete and it makes no sense. In this case, the best thing to do would be just to move the commas. She dug in her bag for her cigarettes and, finding them, quickly lit one. As you can say, if you now take away the bracketing words, you get she dug in her bag for her cigarettes and quickly lit one. It's not a great sentence, but it makes sense, which is better than nothing. Now, a bracketing comma used as an interruption can be used on its own and not as part of a pair when the interruption comes at the beginning or the end of a sentence. Okay, this is for two reasons. You never put a comma at the beginning or end of a sentence. Can you imagine it? Like, how weird would that look? The other reason is because there's nothing else to separate it from. It's not a pause in speech. It's an interruption or additional information from the full sentence. For example, at the end of the day, I think I can count this as a job well done. Or, I think we can count this as a job well done at the end of the day. Now, both are technically correct, and the sentences both make sense without the additions, although I personally feel that the second one feels a little bit clunky and odd to me. But again, that's the difference with personal preference, as I know many people that would speak the sentence in that way. So, bracketing, comma, golden rules. We would use a pair for a weak interruption, which could be removed from a sentence without ruining the comprehension of the sentence. If the interruption comes at the beginning or the end of a sentence, we would use just the one bracketing comma. We would make sure the words we isolate with the commas are really an interruption and that the sentence makes sense without them and flows on its own. So let's recap all the commas once more before I say goodbye. We use a listing comma in a list of 3 or more items or people where the words and or would be possible instead. We use a joining comma before the words and, or, but, when, yet, or while, followed by a complete sentence. We use a gapping comma to show that words have been left out of a sentence instead of repeating them. We use a pair of bracketing commas to set off an interruption in the middle of a sentence, but only one if the interruption is at the beginning or the end of a sentence. Well done, guys. We got through it. I hope that this has made things a little clearer for you and a little bit easier. As always, if you've got any questions or suggestions of things that you want me to cover, hit me up on here or one of my social media accounts. I'm always happy to help. Until next time, blessed be and happy writing.